Thank you once again for joining this panel. This very first conversation is something very dear to my heart personally as a storyteller. So I count it a privilege to, be hosting this because I think it's an opportunity for me to learn and also to, extend that opportunity to others like myself. Before I start, I would introduce myself. I am Julie Ako, the Chief Executive Officer at Albancho, but I also just like to call myself a storyteller, like, FO has taught us. And this is just not a conversation, but an opportunity to showcase what we've been working on for over the past 2 years at Albancho. So I hope that at the end of this conversation, you're able to take away from what we are discussing and see the future of African storytelling in your own hands. Thank you so much. Okay. Yeah. So the title of this conversation, Extracting the Stories Around, as simplistic as it sounds, I think it's also very complex in terms of, choosing what stories to tell and also finding the characters that are compelling enough to follow in that story. I would like to start with you, Efo. And you've crafted shows and stories that have shown your understanding of how to create compelling characters, especially when these characters are swept by historical events or cultural changes. So how do you balance, selecting these stories and balancing it with the grandeur of the events that has happened to them? Take, for instance, COVID. When we're talking about these culturally changing events and we want to tell a story from a particular perspective, how do you balance the events and the people?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to come here.
Thank you, sir.
I also want to say, it's an honor to be on the same panel with my co-panelists. And obviously to say, I really want to commend Albancho. It's been a long trek for you guys to get here. But I think it's really important that Albancho is driven by young storytellers, because I think there's a lot that can be shared in terms of how they see, storytelling in this age of technology, in this age of artificial intelligence, in this age of rapid, historical happenings, and in this age of expanded audiences that are also very, very specific about what they watch. I think it's important that storytellers are talking to each other and engaging these realities with a little more intentionality. Yeah. So, to your question, how do you create the kind of characters that engage historical happenings in a sort of like, how shall I say, profound ways? Yeah. I have a straight up system of stories that I think work. The 4 C's, I've always talked about that. Context is everything. It's not really, the same thing is happening, like you take COVID. COVID happened across the world. But the context of COVID is not the same everywhere in the world. There is a way in which context really does mean culture. And culture really does mean a worldview, value system. Mm-hmm. And it is from that place that characters are formed. It is from that place that the conflict is really profiled. But more than anything else, it is from that place of a cultural, profile that you engage the choice to be made. Mm-hmm. And I think really at the end of the day, regardless of what the happening is, the context, the world of the story, what really makes that character interesting is a value system, which is what engages the conflict and leads to them making a choice. The reason we stay and watch a film to the end is really two reasons. One, we find the conflict interesting enough, big enough, life-changing enough, that we know that the character will not be the same at the end of it. We also find a world that is interesting to us, that has things that might be familiar to us, but certainly is constructed in an authentic way that we actually can, there's believability, plausibility. But at the end of the day, every film is about the choice that this character makes. And for me, those are the things that I truly focus on. I think in the end, all stories, people think stories, just about the imagination. I think it's a lot of imagination, but at the end of the day, it's also a lot about assimilation. It's about how much of this world have you assimilated, what values have you ascribed, how do you design this character to be an embodiment of these values, and what does this value lead to when choices need to be made?
Thank you so much. That's such a profound way to look at it. Thank you so much, Efo. Odolina, given your expertise in building story worlds, could you talk to us about the importance of your story building and conflict in crafting your characters for this story that you've chosen, and if possible, some of the techniques that you work with?
Okay. I'd like to say, before probably I answer the question specifically about building the world of the story, is for me, I think it all emanates from the character.
Yeah.
From the character, and as my co-panelist has said, what their value system is. Going even back a little bit, again, backtracking, our whole lives, basically, as human beings, are basically made up of little decisions that we make, and not so little decisions that we make, both big and small. And all these decisions that we make have repercussions. There are, what's the word I'm looking for? All decisions that, yes, consequences, that's the word I was looking for, all have consequences. And sometimes, and often enough in life, we don't really think about the consequences of our actions because they might be as small as, should I take coffee or tea? But they could be bigger, and it could seem small at the time you're taking it, but the consequences of it may be huge. So characters are always making choices. And these choices that they make may conflict with the context that they are set in, or the situation that they are in, or the other characters that inhabit the spaces where they make those choices may have their own choices that they are also making. And so the conflict becomes essentially the meeting place of decisions that one character makes and the multiple decisions that many other characters make that inhabit the same space. And they are united together by an event. And conflicts always are set in a particular place. Or why is that? It's because human beings, all of us, have three dimensions, which is social dimension, psychological dimension, and a physical dimension. And when we talk about the social dimension, we are talking about things like the role that they play. Are they a mother or a father? Are they a teacher? Are they a doctor? So then that implies the space that they inhabit. And so we start off with a character, and then we go to the spaces that they inhabit, the world that they inhabit, through their social dimension, the roles that they play, and the places that they have to inhabit by virtue of the social roles that the character plays. So for me, my general approach is to build context, to build the world of a story emanating from the character. Usually that gives you the direction that you can potentially take to develop that from the character. Well, at least that's one of the ways that you can do it. But I feel that it's one of the important and fundamental ways that you can start building that world from the social dimension of the characters and the spaces that they inhabit.
Yeah, and I think that it also alludes to the little complexity of screenwriting, because you're taking all of these elements, you're considering all of these factors that you just analyzed and putting it in one story thread, or a few story thread in one feature, one duration. So it's like, how much of this do you have to be conscious of? How much of this perspective are you putting into the story that makes a compelling watch?
Well, in order to make it work, in your writing, you always need to find a situation that brings all your players or / your characters together and unites them in a stronghold where the only way out is conflict, out of which someone will walk away either winning or losing. But ultimately, whatever situation was at the beginning of your story will ultimately change at the end due to the conflict.
Cool. Thank you so much, Odolina. I'm coming to you, Kelechi, and I want to talk more from the perspective of, as a performer, you've had to engage with several stories, and there are times when your reality as a person, comes in. You have to look through that perspective to understand the stories or the characters in front of you. Have you had issues with marrying these ideas that are written on paper and the reality of things? And what do you do in such cases where you think that they don't match reality?
Okay, thank you everybody for being here. I'm excited to be here with my bros and my aunt here. So, reality. Sometimes we're Nigerians. Okay, I've had to be in a film where the police were actually working and everything was going fine and all. And I'm like, at the end of the day, if you're an average person or a poor person in Nigeria, for example, it's difficult to get justice. Sometimes we tell these stories because we just want to happily ever after. But the truth about the stories is, if I was poor or average, I didn't have somebody to speak for me, it's really difficult. If I had money and had influence, yes, these guys will work. So I've had stories sometimes, and I question them, and is this real? Is this something we face? Is this our reality here? But sometimes people write for different reasons, for entertainment, for commercial success and all. And as an actor, sometimes producer have to give you balance, So we have to do, sometimes for me, it's not really what I want, but I'm not in charge directly. I'm not producing, I'm not writing, I'm not directing, So sometimes I just have to do what they want me to do, But opportunity where I have to speak, I'm like, let's marry this with reality. But sometimes the executive producer brings in money, they want to sell, they have an idea. They have something they want you to do, Like Collision Course, for example. When we're making Collision Course, the scene where the bullet was discharged, the policeman officer was supposed to kill the guy, actually, But because we're trying to also tell the story from the side of the police, because Collision Course was about police brutality, but it was also about the story of the police guys, They're not well paid. They're not well paid where they stay. Because I actually went to the barracks to film, and when we went there to film a scene, I actually cried. Because these guys, psychologically, they're not okay. And you're giving them guns, you give them AK-47s. I started to understand why, the frustration can show. So the director, at the end of the day, because it was going to be too direct, if we had shot the scene the way the writer wanted it to be, like you kill this, the policeman kills this guy, it should have just been, this is just exactly how all of them are. Yeah. But because we're telling the story from their own perspective, He was frustrated. He had issues with his wife. He was just needed to get that money. But he came to a compromise with the other character after explaining to him that, look, this is the system messing us up, not us. You know, so we said, let it be an accidental discharge. That was on set. That was a reality because we talked to the director about it. If we kill this guy, what are we saying? We're still saying the same thing, that these guys are just crazy. But we're trying to tell a story in such a way that we want to understand from their own perspective, which a lot of people didn't like. That's why storytelling is versatile. You can tell the story you want. A lot of people were like, no, policemen are brutal. They just kill. You're telling this story as if we want them to, you want us to understand, sympathize with them. But we're not trying to sympathize with them, but we're just saying if the system is not fixed, then these things will happen. It was an accidental discharge, which simply means that some of these guys are not well trained to handle guns. Some of them are not well trained psychologically to understand how to talk to people. So on set, the director and me and the other actor, we had to talk about it and said, okay, let's make this an accidental discharge. That's one of the ways I know this has happened for me as an actor. So it's also important when you're working with people who listen to you and who want to see where you're coming from as an actor. You can have those changes and those things as reality coming into the system. But if you work with people that just want you to do what you want to do, you don't have a choice. You just go perform, get your balance and step out.
Cool. This actually brings me to, the next question I was going to ask you, Efo, about, what we call collective consciousness. He was saying in his own experience how, from his perspective, this police officer is going to do a certain thing in a particular direction, but then still didn't resonate with a couple of people because he got the feedback and they're like, nah, police are bad for bad sake. And so there is probably a collective consciousness in the society where we just by default see them this way. So you as a writer, how do you work around your fresh perspective and expectations in terms of what the audience wants to see?
I actually think in that scene, the idea that it was an accidental discharge is the only thing that makes the film work. The truth of the matter is, what that says to you is that both the police and us, the police themselves are victims of their system. And basically sort of seeks for all of us to try to fix it. Why am I referring to that? Storytelling is not only reflection, it's also refraction. If you're a storyteller, you could as well be a documentary person if all you do is show us what we know. The reason a lot of films are so silly and not worth the money is because the writer is basically documenting what we live every day. What is your insight? Why are you amused? What's your value system? What are you asking us to think about? If you make a film that does not end with a certain insight, regardless of its genre, whether it's comedy, thriller, you can't just write things. Which is why I make the distinction to all my mentees. There's a difference between script writing and storytelling. A storyteller understands he or she understands themselves to be a muse, a philosopher, a community thinker, a deep mind, not merely a mirror. To mirror is important because also there is plausibility. You've got to be able to have some way in which the audience connects with the world of your story, the context of your conflict. But at the end of the day, the point of that character confronting something that causes them to change is so critical. And that's why I think it's important for writers to have a very large consciousness that understands life not as a flat, not a two-dimensional thing, and to understand that, there are many dimensions to reality. and to take us on a journey of those dimensions is really why we go to the movies. We go to the movies so that we can suspend disbelief. When we go to the movies and we can predict what is going to happen next, you've just stolen our money. And that's really why I think, what you're doing is important. And Albancho has to create that movement where people are pushing the envelope a little bit in Nollywood. Because the reason Nollywood has a difficulty when it comes to audiences outside of his immediate experience is because people are demanding much more of it than reflections. And if you've made 2,000 movies a year for 25 years, the question is, what have you not yet explored? That's really what we should be asking people to do now.
Thank you. Odolina, do you want to add, because I saw you, you can add to that, please, in terms of balancing, collective consciousness and your fresh perspective as a writer?
Thank you very much. I wanted to add maybe in terms of craftsmanship, like a few tips that can help writers. What I usually suggest is two things. So one is for a writer to do research that relates to the theme or the topic or maybe the context, place around which the story is situated. That's one thing. And that is just to have some context, some knowledge, to be grounded in what happens in life or what is going on. But there's part two, and the part two is, as you're doing the research, or at the very least, when you get to the end of the research, and I completely agree here, such a strong point that was made, that you need to ask yourself, how do I feel? What do I think about what I've seen? So you need to know the reality out there, one, and then pass it through your own prism or through your own system of values. I often tell my students that we all know a little bit of life, what goes on around us, but we are less interested in just knowing factually what is around us, then that is just news, and even news has a spin to it. But we as humans are really interested in perspective. Okay, there's something going on, but how do you, the filmmaker, the scriptwriter, how do you interpret it? What do you think about it? What is your system of values? So sometimes I give my students this kind of exercise when I find that it's hard for them to be vulnerable or open up, or when they have a block in creating a story. I tell them, what makes you angry? What about the things that you see around you that makes you angry? And they wonder, they say, well, kind of, why are you asking? But when I prod them to answer, they start saying, well, I'm angry because of this, and that. And I say, well, why are you angry about it? You wouldn't be angry about something if it didn't mean something to you, if it didn't touch or somehow affect or threaten your own system of values. So, yes, I do agree that certainly we need research to ground the story in the world around us, but we need to have a strong perspective. How do we feel about it? Or just pass it through our own system of values to mean something, because I completely agree. We listen to stories to get meaning. Life is really very chaotic. It really doesn't make sense. Meaning imposes structure on the world around us, imposes a system of values. And as humans, the reason why we read stories, listen to stories, watch movies, visual stories, is our search to have some sort of meaning.
Thank you. That was really profound. And I'll have a follow-up question because, personally, as a writer myself, I find that over the course of my experiences in life, the way that I approach certain ideas would change. Like your experiences and growth seep into the way you tell stories. So is there a way, as a young writer who hasn't experienced so much, that you can maximize the lens that you have to tell a rounded story? Because I'm sure you get what I mean.
Well, yes, I have a few ideas, and one of them relates to a personal discovery. I'm also a writer myself, so personal discovery. I'm always looking for different ways to find stories. And one of the techniques that I discovered was perspective, changing perspective. So there is an example I often provide to my students, which I don't mind sharing, which is, so I give them an example of the beginning of a story. I tell them, well, writing class is at 9:30. So I get up in the morning, I make sure I'm on time, I sit in my car, I drive, I have a route I take to the university, and that's the route I use. So let's say I'm driving and I need to be on time. I'm driving, and then we have a area close to the university, before the University of Ghana. It's called Medina, and that's a very busy commercial center, lots of people, it's crowded, lots of little buses, like the little buses you have here that I hear are called Danfo. In Ghana, we call them trotros. So we have a lot of these, and they're all crowded in there, and it's an absolutely crazy spot. So I'm driving, and I go there. I'm just crossing the intersection, and then a trotro suddenly sort of veers right in front of me and actually tears my bumper off, which is true. It has actually happened. Tears my bumper off. So I get out. I'm upset. A policeman comes in, and in a nutshell, I'm late. That's the rest of the story. So I often tell them that, okay, there's this story. But if you think about it carefully, this story is told from my perspective. So I'm the one rushing to come to class on time, and I'm upset. What happens? Then I thought to myself, what if I change my perspective? Instead of telling the story from me, my perspective, I tell it from the story of that same trotro driver who, damaged my car. So that could be another story. So the trotro driver maybe was driving very fast because his mother was in hospital. That's an example. His mother was in hospital, or his kid was in hospital, he was distraught, and then that's another story. So we have the driver, he has to work, he has a kid in the hospital, he has to go there, he has to drive like a madman, and now he is stuck in this situation. We could take another perspective from the same story. I could extract another story from the policeman who comes in there. For example, maybe the policeman went to church for the first time in his life and got saved, as an example. Okay, so now he wants to start a new life, but he doesn't have any money at all. He's completely broke, and there's something urgent he has to pay for. So he comes in there, he's on the scene of the accident, and he has to make a moral decision. Should he take a bribe or he shouldn't take a bribe? And what will be, the story could be the consequence of that choice that he may or may not make there. So sometimes I thought to myself that storytelling is often very much tied to perspective. And we can move our perspective within even one single story to extract so many other stories, because it's a lot of it is about perspective.
Great, thank you so much, Odolina. Kelechi, as a performer, right, and also a storyteller, you're also a producer. Do you think that there are better ways that we can represent the true human nature in our stories? You've had to read a lot of scripts. If you were to give feedback to writers, what would that be?
If I was to give feedback to writers, well, Nigeria, I always like to use, because it's the reality, I have conversations with a couple of people, and being true to yourself is not easy, because most writers or most filmmakers have this particular story they want to tell. But by the time they're looking for money to tell the story, nobody wants to give them because they feel like, we can't explore this, it's too risky to do this. Give us stories that, we're used to, things that people can buy into and all. So it's a slippery slope, kind of, except if you have somebody who's funding you. So some people end up making stories that people want to see, get money, make stories people want to see, and then later on in life, they make the stories that they want to make. Mm-hmm. For example, Mami Water. When CJ wrote Mami Water, I wanted to make it. It was funny, because you get into an office and tell somebody, I want to make a story about Mami Water. Hey, blood of Jesus Christ, God forbid, Mami Water, you want to, so... I use the system, Nigeria, for example. It's not that easy for us here to do exactly what we want to do, but with time. And I think it's opening up. People are accepting personal stories. People are accepting cultural stories. Like if you look around this Ageshikoli, there's another one coming up. So we're really making stories. People are even looking for, back in the days, they'll tell you, we want love and drama. But now they tell you, we want culture, we want this, we want that. So with time, I think everything evolves, So for me, it's just keep doing what you're doing.
Great, thank you. Therefore, you have opportunity to listen to a lot of pitches from writers and young filmmakers. And I'm sure that there are times when you hear these stories and they just sound like something out of Hollywood or another industry entirely. And you're always a pioneer of telling your own story. How do we tell our own stories? What do you think is our biggest challenge in telling our stories in our own way, and how can we overcome these problems?
I'm assuming that to be two different questions. How do we tell our stories, and then how do we tell it in our
own way?
I'm not sure we have any other story to tell but our story. And the reason we end up telling a Hollywood story is often because the storyteller doesn't even know our own story. There's a lot of identity involved in how you tell stories. You have to, it's not just the identity of who you are, but the identity of what you embrace, who you want to be, who you think you are, and how much you know about that. And I think that's really very important, that the storytellers taking that journey of self understands, what the prism is, the lens through which you see life, which is why I think it's so important when she's talking about perspective. Part of perspective is also who you are. I always tell people that facts is what happened. Truth is really what you think of it. And we don't see things as they are. We see it as we are. And so I do think, that's one. But how do we tell it in our own way? It's interesting that you say that, because one of the things that I think Nollywood is sort of known for is that it has a way of telling a story. The question is that way the best way to expand its audience? Right now, our way is very over the top. Our way is very dramatic. It's we take little things and go larger than life. And our way is a lot of dialogue. Is that way the best way to take us to where our film industry needs to go? For me, I think the next generation of storytellers, which is what I hope Alban Show is about, is embracing a more cinematic view of Nollywood. Regardless of the genre, filmmaking is visual. The visual language is known. It is how audiences connect, because every story is a human story at the end. We all can communicate just looking at each other. How do we take all of that into our storytelling so that we talk less and do more? I feel like we have a lot of incredible actors. They've had a lot of, what you did in Collision is amazing. There's no actor anywhere in the world that will not respect that performance. But that performance was not about the words. That's why it was such a filmic piece. And then it was about how these two characters inhabited a very closed space in that car. And even though they were talking, what they were about was that these were two victims, sort of like captured together by something that happened. And for me, that's where we have to take our storytelling. We have to take it to where it's more visual, where it's more intense, where we actually understand how to build narratives, how to emotionalize, how to create tension, and to understand the musicality of visuality. The idea that, like music, you have a first stanza, you have a chorus, you have solos, it really comes together as one when you understand the visual language. And I think the writers have to understand more the visual language than a lot of words. Now when I commission a script, if it's 60 minutes, I don't want 60 pages of dialogue. It's ridiculous. Descriptions is how I know you know that this is a visual form. And I think that's really one of the things that I think the greater writers do. They're able not just to describe the action, but to describe why the action. They're able to write what's going on in the mind of the character that helps us to tie together why they are doing this or not doing this. I think in their lies, the surprises, the twists, the turns, that really make for an interesting film. So when you ask, how do we tell our stories, we need to know more about who we are. There's a lot of colors to us. It's not just about language, it's also about location, spaces. Too many of our films are almost, shall I say, trapped within four walls. We need to engage the spaces of what we call Nigeria. But you can't do that if you're a writer who lives in Lagos, works in Lagos, does everything you do from a one-room apartment, and that's it. You're limited. So writers themselves must have an expanded world. You must learn to travel. You must learn to engage. You can't challenge a character, for instance, to speak with a stutter or to learn a different language if you yourself think that's too hard. So the bigger the world of the writer, the more you can demand from the characters that you are writing, because they are all expressions of who you are.
It's really great. For this, actually, I want us to quickly touch on, the difference between a writer and a storyteller. We had this conversation. I'm like, everyone needs to hear this. In a world where anything can write now, anything you can help you write. So what differentiates you, a storyteller, from just saying, I am a writer?
So while I was in Uganda, I was having this sort of session with young filmmakers. And I brought out my Chat GPT-4. And I asked them to give me a premise. Any premise. Don't even give me synopsis. Just give me the premise. What happens if? And they gave me 3. We put it into the ChatGPT. And 17 minutes flat. We had 3 scripts, 60 pages long each. So the actual act of writing is no longer. You can actually work with a robot. Now, Hollywood is working with robots that will not only do voices, they would do performance. All our jobs are in great danger if we don't understand that the one thing that the robot cannot do is actually create the character, create a world with detail, create a conflict, because a robot is a robot. But when you get to the place of choice, a robot is inhuman, does not have the value system which you impute into that narrative process. And therein lies what makes you different. I was speaking with one of my friends yesterday. He's a writer. And he comes in and he tells me this story that is just amazing about, the levels of consciousness, the worlds of consciousness and the worlds of reality, and the different gods that are connected to actually how we feel. And he was saying things about, a god who uses greed to actually, a god who uses laughter, a god who uses... And I sat there just staring at him, because at the end of the day, there was no script on he hasn't even written the script. But if I had money yesterday, I begged him yesterday to do a teaser, like a short, to just talk about this world and talk about the characters in them and talk about how, what they're confronted with. I was in Durban at the Durban Film Art just this weekend, and one of the presenters, a young filmmaker, told a story of how someone went for surgery, their throat, they had a surgery, and then somehow their talent was stolen. And then it's not just that the talent is stolen, she finds another person who sings exactly like she used to, and finds that the same doctor stole the talent and gave it to another person. Now, it sounds almost impossible, but all of us sat down for more than 30 minutes to hear the story. Why? It takes us to a place of dreams, a place that's, not normal. And I think that's really where the storyteller is different from just a writer. A storyteller expands our world. A storyteller makes us go, are you kidding me? A storyteller looks at, stuff, not just from what has happened, to what's going on in the mind of not just the person to who it's happening, but how it's impacting the whole environment. How do you think big? What is the scale of the conflict itself? I think that's where technology is pushing everybody, because it's asking questions, and we actually have an existential problem. Because if you're still just learning how to write exactly the same thing that Nollywood did last year and then 2 years ago,
Interesting. I mean, I can go on and on, because this is like one of my favorite conversations to have. We're talking about extracting the stories around. And Odolina, I want to ask you, because they say there's this popular saying that an artist is meant to reflect the times. An artist is meant to reflect. We reflect our times, right? What do you think, as an African writer, should... And you're not prescribing, just from your own perspective, what should we pay attention to more in our writing nowadays?
Add to your question.
Yes, please.
I'd like to add to the question: how does an artist not just reflect the times, but provoke the times?
Yeah. Thank you, Efo.
Okay. There is a way that it can be done, I believe. And I think it goes back to the maybe rather boring fundamental of research. Well, two things for the writer, African writer, is doing your homework, doing research, or writing about what you know. I think this is really important. And one of the reasons why sometimes, writing is mediocre or not up to par is simply to those two fundamental problems. If we are to be telling our own stories and to tell our stories effectively, it's like Efo said, we need to know who we are. And how do you get to know who you are? Two ways. By being vulnerable about yourself, where you live, your social connections, and so on and so forth. Or going to do the research to understand a particular place where your story is situated, the characters, the social dimension, economic, and so on and so forth, their value systems, what are their norms, what do they do, what are their norms, their rituals, why do they do what they do. And one of the things I think that is often a problem is this issue of vulnerability. And why do I say so? When you're doing research about something you want to write on, as a writer, you have to be very open. You have to be vulnerable. You have to be very open. Sometimes you need to even set aside your own biases or predispositions and just observe and watch and allow yourself to immerse yourself into the value system of the place you're planning to write about. I think that's really very important. And when you're able to connect, and usually the word research often doesn't sound very enticing to write. It sounds terribly boring, but I keep coming back to it. The way it becomes interesting is when you research deeply, the process of research will make you start being emotionally hooked into it. So by the time you get midway into it, you're already emotionally vested into it. And by the time you're done with it, it almost becomes your story and you start having some sort of your own perspective on it. So yes, unfortunately, research. Yes. Or to write about the things that we do know and add the element of perspective, but also to be very, very observant. I think observation is fundamental to good writing. And maybe the second thing is, I guess I'll be repeating myself. Observation, yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. And the final question is, what are the most significant challenges that you faced when you encounter stories that are supposed to be about you? So I don't know if you've had to work on stories that really resonate with you so much, and then you have to tell this story to a wider audience, people that are, I think it speaks to the idea of vulnerability as well. So what do you face any challenge in depicting such stories?
Well, I think one of the challenges of depicting such stories is it messes with my head a lot because it's real to you, and I've been on this set and I played this character because I lost my father, not really early, but quite early, and it had to be a character who, I'm a first son in Igbo land. I don't know if people are Igbo here, but for Igbos, being the first son is like being a sacrifice. Because my father too was the first son. And he had to put his brothers first, put the other people first, So in everything he did, he sacrificed so much that at the end of the day, he used to be looked up to, but then when every other person grew up, it now felt like, we'll not send you again, because at the end of the day, he sacrificed his whole life and everything for his, It's like, it was your first son in Igbo land, you're like Jesus Christ, you're sacrifice and all. So I played this character, and it was the same thing, and also because I'm the first son. So the danger is, I think sometimes you don't know when you're acting and when it's real, and I broke down a lot on the set because, it was real for me, and I'd prefer to play characters that that I have to get into this character because it's, you're trying to be that character, you're playing that character. But if you play characters that are you, that's close to you, it really messes with you because it's very real. Every scene, every word, it's enjoyable as an actor sometimes, but it breaks you down. And after that set, I had to see somebody. I had to see somebody to talk to, and sorry.
I'm sorry.
So yeah, for me, acting is something I take personally, and when I see stories that resonate with reality, I get into it so much, and I've done a couple of, not too much, but about 2-3 jobs where after doing that, I have to, see somebody, talk to myself, and sometimes I wonder, is it worth it, because what you're paid, what you get at the end of the day, the way the system is and all. I don't know, can I just hold on now?
Yeah, thank you. The fact that you even emotional around just talking about it, I mean, anyone can relate with that. And I think that's the essence of the whole storytelling thing, creating this authenticity that someone else can connect to in such a manner that they feel like this is their own life as well. I think we are privileged. Efo, do you have anything else to add as we round up this session?
Not a lot. Just to encourage those who are here to push the envelope. I think that there's a lot that Africa is waiting on in terms of stories out of Nigeria. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of young people in different African countries who have been inspired by Nollywood, but who are also expanding that dramatic way of storytelling and beginning to embrace the many Africas that exist. The rural Africa, the urban, the diasporic. There's a way in which many of our lives and our stories are intersecting that we need to take things to another level. We need to start thinking of Africa in science, Africa in technology, Africa in 30 years' time. Not just the Africa of corruption and war and disease that you already know, but what can Africa be? I think the capacity to foreshadow a future different from our past is going to be critical in our storytelling industries, helping us change our story, whether it's politics or socially. I think our writers our filmmakers can be far more consequential to creating the impact that leads us in a place of change. Our stories should not continue to repeat what we are already experiencing, because many of us are depressed, even more depressed, by watching it over and over and over again. And so we're looking for stories that challenge us, stories that create for us heroes, whether they be in the political sphere, the scientific sphere, the technology sphere. We need young people who show a belief in a different kind of Africa. And the only way we can find and begin to think of that is through our stories. America would never have had a black president if we didn't see it first in a TV series. They almost had a female president because we saw it in a story. What is the story you are telling that changes our immediate history? That's my challenge.
Thank you so much, Efo. It's been such an amazing time. We've come to the end of this session, and I am sure that we've had so much profound knowledge here. As we move into the next session, there will be a demo right now about the Albansho product, which I would like you all to also, take a look at before you leave. But thank you so much. This has been a pleasure.